Greetings, everyone. Welcome to day 11 of our PMP exam prep step by step. In our last session, we started with project schedule management. And we have looked at 3 processes. We will step into the remainder of the processes today and complete this particular knowledge area. The first process that we look at is estimate activity durations. Estimate activity durations. These processes have inputs as project management plan, project documents, environmental factors, and organizational process assets. This particular process will have different tools. Now, what we are really doing here is we are finding out durations for these activities. And in doing so, we'll use different tools, such as, of course, expert judgment, and then very specific estimating tools like analogous estimating, parametric estimating, 3-point estimating, and so on. As an output for this, from this process, we will get, the main output that we'll get is the duration estimates. In other words, what is the time duration and this activity will take? And then, of course, we'll document the basis of estimates, what was our thinking in coming up with these estimates, so that later on, if someone have a look at it, they'll know what is the logic behind it, and they can investigate if some assumptions still hold true, and so on and so forth. Now, estimate activity duration is really about estimating number of works required. So what we have so far is we have all the activities in place. We know which are the activities and what really we need to do on these activities. And in this particular process, when we are doing the estimation of duration, we are really estimating duration of these activities. We are trying to find out how much time these activities will take. There are several things that will come in play when we estimate durations. We look at the scope. We look at the scope, and that is something that we have determined. We look at the scope, and we'll also look at, when we're doing it, what is the kind of resource that we're using? What is the skills resource have? What is the quality of the resource? And also resource calendar. Now, for example, if you are employing experienced resource, then the same activity will probably take less time. If you are using less experienced resource, probably it'll take more time. Then resource calendar is another thing that we should not forget to consider when we are estimating activity duration. Resource calendar tells us when this resource is available. For example, if this particular resource or the employee, the team member is going on vacation, then that resource calendar for that particular team member will capture that. And we need to use this because we should not assume that because this particular resource is doing this particular activity, we should be careful not to assume that this person is available during that period, because that person is going on vacation. Oftentimes, what happens is we estimate using this progressive elaboration that we talked about in our last process, if you remember. Now, progressive elaboration is that concept, that methodology where you plan in details the near-term activities and you leave the activities that is further out for later planning. And this is really the progressive elaboration. So what we are going to do is, let's say next month, we are going to estimate in details. And then when after the next month, we'll go for the next month. So because we probably think we'll have more details on those activities at that point of time. So this is what is progressive elaboration. Now there are some considerations that we need to take upon when we are doing activity duration, estimation of activity duration. First and foremost, we need to realize that it is not just the effort, it is also what resources are available, what skill level is there, all this make up what time will take. And it is not a straight line calculation. So we have to take all these different factors in determining what will be the activity duration that will take to complete this particular activity. Then we need to be aware of a few concepts. One is law of diminishing returns. Now, law of diminishing returns essentially says that if we are increasing one input, keeping all the other inputs same, and after some time, initially what we'll find is because we've increased that particular input, which impacts the result, because we're increasing this input, we'll see good return. But after some time, if we keep on increasing that, what we'll find that return that we're getting up by increasing that input will keep on going down. Now let me give you an example. Let's say in our project, we have come to realize that the people, the team member, they are getting slowed down because they are using not very efficient computers. And so we decide to increase the processing power of the computers for the team members. When we initially increase, we'll see this good jump in the return, the output, the productivity. Then we might think, hey, let's increase some more, But what we'll find is, after some time, even if you're increasing the processing power or getting new computers, we are not getting the results or the same increase in return as we had when we increased the first time. So that's law of diminishing returns. Then there's a concept of number of resources. Let's say we are doing a work, and if we found that this particular work activity, if we employ one person, it will take 15 days. Now, it doesn't mean that if we employ 2%, it will be 7.5 days. If we employ 15%, it will be 1 day. Because what happens is, as you increase the number of resources, there are some factors coming, like communication will become more complex. There will be learning curve involved with the new resources. And so what we're saying is, just by increasing the number of resources, it will not proportionally decrease the time that will take. The activity duration will not proportionally decrease. We should also be aware of the technology. Many a times, if we go for some advanced technology, So new technology or new tools that are available in the market, we might be able to reduce the time that an activity will take very significantly. So we, as a project manager, we should be aware of what is there, what kind of tool is there out there, and that we can employ. And of course, when we want to take that in, we'll, of course, as a project manager, we'll have to do a cost analysis and see it is effective from our project perspective or not. And then, of course, we should be very aware of the staff motivation. Now, as all of us know, that there is an inherent tendency for lot of people to procrastinate, which really means people tend to do most of the work at the last minute. It is also called student syndrome, and it is also termed as Parkinson's law, which really says that work fills the time that is available. For example, if you give the same amount of work, and let's say it can be done in 3 days, and to some person you say, okay, I'm giving you 5 days, that person will take 5 days because this particular work will fill that time. So that is Parkinson's law. And so we need to be always motivating the staff and see that we don't let that procrastination creep in the project effort. Now, we'll talk about different estimating techniques. Let's start with analogous estimating. Analogous estimating is an estimating method which is really, we base our estimation on previous similar project. Let's say we are building a house. We are building a house and we want to estimate how much time it will take. So we have built another house, or our company has built another house before. Of course, not exactly the same, slightly different. So we look at the estimating of that particular house and use that to estimate the house that we'll be building. So from there, we'll see how much time it would take for the full house, and each pieces how much time will take, and so we'll go top down. This estimating technique is often used when there is limited detailed information. We probably at this point don't have a lot of detailed information on what kind of activities that we have to do for at each level, at detail level, and so it is easier for us to do this kind of estimating. As you can very well understand here, this type of estimation is less expensive because it takes less effort to do this kind of estimation. But having said that, this will also be less reliable because no two projects are same. And the previous projects, the conditions in which that particular previous project was done would have been different, and probably there are some other different conditions that will creep in our project. As a result of all these things, this kind of estimation technique is less reliable. In other words, you get what you give, right? I mean, we are spending less amount of effort, which is less expensive, and so we get something that is less reliable. Then the next estimating technique that we're talking about is something called parametric estimating. The parametric estimating also is based on historical data, meaning a previous project. But instead of taking the full estimation from that project, it applies or it takes in the historical data from that previous project and uses some algorithms. Now let's give an example. Again, we are building a house. So instead of going about and finding how much time the previous house took, construction of the previous project took, and just directly apply it, we don't go that way. We go in details. And now when we have come to a room and we have to find out how much time it will take to tile the floor. Now, what we'll do here is we take a historical data from the previous project. So how much time was taken to tile 1 square foot of the floor? We take that and apply it here. Now we know in our project what is the square feet. And we apply that time taken per square foot from the previous project, apply in our formula here and find out how much it will take. So we are really applying some algorithms on historical data. It also can use statistical relationships. And of course, accuracy depends on model and data. So let me give another example. Let's say we are doing a software project. We want to do estimation. And let's assume we are using something called function point analysis. We have taken our requirement and broken it down to what are the different functions or function points. And we categorize them into complex, medium, or simple. Now, we go to a previous project and see how much time the complex function takes or how much time medium function takes and simple function takes. We go to another project that uses the same methodology to do the estimation. Now, we take those and apply in our model. And we take that data and apply in our model to do the estimation. Now, as you can see, it will depend on the kind of model, how we have determined those function points. And it will also depend on the data in terms of, how much time the complex function will take, the data that you have taken from the previous project, how accurate is that? So this accuracy of this parametric estimation will depend on the model that we are applying and the data that we are using in this particular model. Now, one thing we need to understand is it is not necessary that we have to apply one estimating technique across all the projects. We can use this estimation techniques in combination with some other method. Maybe you have done analogous estimating and some part of it you are doing parametric estimating or whatever it is. We can mix and match depending on what will give us more accurate estimation, and depending on what data that we have and what is applicable to our project. Then there is something called bottom-up estimation. Now, bottom-up estimating is, as the name suggests, it starts with the lowest level component in WBS. So what we do is we look at each of the work packages in the WBS, which are the lowest level components, and we find out, we talk to maybe whoever will be implementing that, talk to them, deliberate, and find out how much time each of these lowest level component will take. And then we'll aggregate them up to find a higher level estimation, and finally at the project level, which will tell us, when we aggregate all the time that will take, all the effort that will take, and we aggregate it up, we get the higher level estimation. Now, there is another, which is 3-point estimation. Now, these estimation techniques really is about considering the uncertainty. Now, let's think about that for a moment. Now, when we are estimating, maybe I have an activity to be done and I want to estimate how much time it will take. Maybe I talk to the team member to figure out how much time it will take. Now, we cannot for certain say what will be the time that will be taken, because there can be lot of, even though it is known or the team member knows exactly how to do it, there can be some element of uncertainty. What happens if the computers give some problem? What happens if they're depending on something and that doesn't work well? So there is an element of uncertainty, and this 3-point estimating takes into consideration this particular uncertainty. So let's see how it is done. It will be done through some kind of probabilistic estimate, and we'll use 3 terms or 3 probabilistic estimate. One is most likely, one is optimistic, and one is pessimistic. Now, as an example again, let's say we ask a team member, okay, you have to do this activity, how much time will take? So yeah, that person might say, hey, it'll take 5 days. So then you say, okay, what is the best estimate? Let's say when you're doing this, you don't face any problem, everything goes smoothly, how much time will take? Then that person will say, hey, probably it'll take 4 days. And what happens if you face some kind of problem? Because all the time we'll face some issues or other. So what is a pessimistic estimate? That person might say it'll take 7 days. So in other words, what we're getting in terms of estimates is most optimistic estimate is 4 days, most likely is 5 days, and pessimistic is 7 days. So we take these 3 numbers or 3 probabilistic estimates in determining the estimate in 3-point estimate. And the way we do it is there are 2 ways to do it. If we use what is called the triangular distribution, we take an average of these 3 estimates, most likely, optimistic, and pessimistic. We just add them up and divide by 3. And there is another way to do it is, which is called beta distribution, where we put more emphasis on the most likely. So what we do is we take optimistic plus 4 times most likely plus pessimistic and divide by 6. So these are the 2 ways we can, or we go about doing 3-point estimating. Then in this, we'll also do some data analysis. And one of them is what we say alternative analysis. And we have looked at that before as well. But let's see in this particular context, how we go about doing alternative analysis. One is on the resource capability or resource skills. So for example, we might think, hey, should we take an experienced resource, or should we take not so experienced resource? Both have their pros and cons. Experienced resource will cost more, but will be probably giving us quicker, the duration will be less, and even probably the quality will be better. Less experienced resource will cost less, but then might take more time in doing it. So there are different alternatives, and we need to determine which alternative we should go in for. Then there will be schedule compression techniques. For example, a user might come and say, hey, you were saying that based on your plan, it will finish in 2 months. But no, from a business perspective, we cannot wait that long. You have to do it in 1.5 months. So in that case, you have to go about compressing your schedule, and there are different techniques that we can use to compress the schedule, and we have to determine which is the best option here, because both have their pros and cons. Then there can be different tools that you want to use, and you want to assess which tool will be better for you in this project. And very often we make this make, rent, or buy decisions. For example, you have a large project and you have a component which it is possible for you to buy it from outside. The question might be, do you do it yourself or do you buy it? Both will have some advantages, both will have some disadvantages. You need to weigh them against each other and determine which is the best option. So these are some alternative analyses that we'll be looking at when we are estimating duration. Then there is this thing called reserve analysis. Reserve analysis comes out of risks that might come in the project. And we look at it in much more details in our risk knowledge area, risk management knowledge area. But essentially, there are two kinds of reserves we are talking about when we are doing reserve analysis. One is what we call known unknown. These are in effect known risks. In other words, we can visualize that these are things that might happen. For example, in your schedule, as you're planning the schedule, what happens if your team member falls sick and cannot come for work for some time? Now, this is a risk, might not happen, but we can think or think about it, and we can even plan for it. So these are identified risks within schedule baseline. So what we'll do is we will take this risk into consideration and apply some extra days to take into so that we take into consideration this risk, and we can include that in the schedule baseline. So the way we do it, we might say in percentage, or we might say fixed work periods, or by some kind of analysis. So for example, we have said that this will take 15 days. We have estimated that. And then on top of that, we said we are adding 10% of let's say 5 days on top of that 1.5 months, so that we can take into consideration the contingency reserve or the risks, identified risks. Now there is another kind of contingency reserve or another kind of reserve analysis, which is also about risk, but these are called management reserves. Management reserves are about unknown, which really means these are something that we can't even think of, and it happens all the time. And so this surprise risk that we can't even think of but can come, and we know this happens all the time. So we take that into consideration, but this is not something that you will consider in your schedule baseline. It will be withheld within the management control. And so, like we said, it will be not included in schedule baseline. So as an example, what might happen is you are doing a project for a client, and we are doing the estimation, and your estimation is exactly when you have done that duration, put it together, and you found that you'll finish in 180 days. On top of that, you said, it'll take, let's put 10 days for contingency reserves. So you are saying that as part of your schedule baseline, it is 190 days. Then, on top of that, the management will probably plan from their end to say that, okay, I'm putting another 10 days for some management reserves for unknown. So these are some reserve analysis that will go in as analysis process. As a result of this, we are getting outputs. The outputs that we get out of estimate duration is duration estimates. Now, duration estimates is really, as we talked about, time periods for each activities, but it will not include lag. We are not talking about lag, because lag and all will apply later on when we are developing the schedule. But it might include the range of or probability. We might not say that this particular activity will take exactly 5 days. We might say it will take between 4 to 5 days. Or with 90% probability, we are saying it will take 5 days. In 100% probability, we are saying it is 6 days. So this is the way we can probably represent these estimates. When we are putting these estimates for each activity as an output, we would also want to put basis of estimates. What has been our thinking during this estimation process? How was it developed? And what kind of assumptions that we made in making these estimates? Are there any constraints that we have had to take into consideration? And what are the risks that have influenced our estimation? So these are things that we'll add in a document when we put the duration estimates. So now this finishes the activity duration. We will now move into the next process, which is develop schedule. Develop schedule, the process, will have inputs as project management plan, documents, agreements, factors, and there are different tools that we'll use. We'll use some resource optimization, network analysis, CPM will be a big thing, and lead and lags, schedule compression, and so on. And finally, what we'll get is the schedule baseline. And so this is the second baseline we're talking about. We talked about scope baseline. This is the second baseline, which is schedule baseline, as well as some other associated documents. So develop schedule. When you're developing schedule, let's step back, think for a moment what we have in our hand. Now what we have is all the activities that will be required in the project. What we have in our hand is how they sequence, what comes first, what comes next, and so on. And also the leads and lags and all that. And what is the relationship and so on. And then we have, for each of these activities, what is the duration. Now when we have all these pieces together, we can bring them together to make the schedule. Now once we make the schedule, or we determine the schedule, we will, and when we are doing that, we would have also assigned project stuff. and get confirmation. In other words, when we are doing this, we would ideally know who is going to do what activity. And it is important that whoever the team members, they are doing this activities, or whoever is doing this activity, they should buy into this information. In other words, they should agree to the duration that you have set. If I say John is doing activity A and it will take 5 days, and John doesn't conform to that, then there is a problem. So because John might not be able to do it, and then the whole project will suffer. So as a project manager, I should get a confirmation from John who is doing this particular activity. We should also, when developing schedule, analyze for conflicts with logical relationship. For example, we have this comes before, this comes after, and if there is something we said loop, closed loop, anything like that, or any kind of conflicts, we need to get into that and resolve that conflict. For example, you might have an imposed dates and you have a dependency. And because of the imposed dates, these dependencies will not work because of the durations that they have. Let's say you have an activity A, activity B. Activity B can do after activity A, and when they are done in sequence, it will be done in 5 days and 5 days. But there is an imposed date in which will not let me take that. So then there is a problem, and we need to get in and resolve that. So once we do this schedule, we have to get an approval and baseline this. So when we baseline this schedule, this is our schedule baseline. It is based on this particular baseline that our project will be measured if we are getting delayed, or if we are on track, and so on. And of course, as we move through the project, we will continually revise and maintain this schedule. We'll have to continually revise and maintain this schedule. Now, one of the methods that we'll use is the critical path method. So let's look at this critical path method. Now, with this critical path method, what we really find or estimate is the minimum project duration. In other words, what is the minimum time that this project can take? We cannot do this project less than that time. This is all that we're saying, and this is what we will be determining using this critical path method. There will be some schedule flexibility, and we'll look at that. Now, what this really means is there will be some floats. In other words, after we have drawn the schedule, we will find that there are some activities, even if it gets delayed for some days, the project end date will not get affected because there is a float in that particular activity at that point where that activity is. And we'll look at that. In this process of calculate critical path method, we'll determine for each of these activities early start date, which is the earliest an activity can start, early finish date, which is the earliest date an activity can finish, late start date, the latest an activity can start without, again, all this is without affecting the end date of the project, and latest an activity can finish without impacting the final project date. So these are things that we'll calculate. And when we use the critical path method, we don't take into consideration if there is a limitation on the resource. For example, because we are really taking into account the duration and the sequence and use that when we are doing that. So any kind of resource limitation, for example, the resource suddenly is not available, then those are things that is not taken into account in this critical path method. Now, a question that might come and that we should be very clear about and will also be tested in your PMP exam is, which is the critical path? Now, there are many different ways to look at which is the critical path. One is, it is the longest path through the project. So basically, because it is the longest path through the project, longest path in terms of duration. Now, because it is the longest path, it really means that determines the time the project will take, or that determines what is the shortest possible project duration. And again, because this is the longest path, there will likely be no float, because we want to finish this project as early as possible, but we are stuck because of this path, because this is the longest path. And typically it is the longest path because all the activities that are there in this particular path and the way they need to be sequenced, we cannot shorten it anymore. And we tie them back to back, and that is the minimum or shortest possible project duration we get. And as a result, it's likely there is no float in that particular path. So the critical path is, in one sense, the longest path through the project. It is the shortest possible project duration, the path that determines our shortest possible project duration, and the path that will have float, zero float. Now, with this, let us draw a schedule. Let us develop a schedule. Now, when we develop a schedule, we'll look at different activities. We'll put different activities. And this is a legend that I'm showing here. In this particular activity, the middle, you see the activity name. And there are some boxes which will give us number. What are they? For example, this particular box will be an early start box, the top leftmost. This particular box will be early finish box, which is the earliest that particular activity can finish. This particular box will be the duration, the time that this particular activity will take. This particular box will be latest. This particular activity can start without impacting the final date of the project. This one is the latest this particular activity can finish without impacting the final date of the project. And this is the float. We call it the total float. In other words, what we are saying is, this is the number of days in this particular activity. Even if we delay by this number of days, the final date is not going to get impacted. So let's look at how all this happens and how does it come together. Let's say in this project, we start a project, we have an activity A, and then after activity A, we have activity B and activity C, because B can be done only after activity A is finished, and C can be done again only after activity A is finished. There's no dependency between B and C. And then after B and C, there is an activity D that needs to be done. D is dependent on B, D is dependent on C. So D cannot start unless B is finished, D cannot start unless C is finished. So this done, and then we are done with the project. It's a pretty simple project, right? There are 4 activities involved. But then, when we take a simple model, it helps us really understand the concept. So this is a simple project with 4 activities, A, B, C, and D. Let's say the duration for each of these activities, for example, A is 7 days, B is 8 days, and D is 12 days, and C is 15 days, right? Now what happens is, we are seeing that the path A, B, D is the total duration for path ABD is 7 plus 8 plus 12, which is 27. And the path for ACD is 7 plus 15 plus 12. So, which is the critical path? For example, this one, ABD, which is 27 days, what we are saying is a non-critical path, and we are saying that ACD is the critical path, because which is the critical path? The longest path is the critical path. And in other words, we cannot do this project in less than 34 days, because ACD is back to back. The first A takes 7 days, C takes 15 days, D takes 12 days. So this is how we determine the critical path, and this is really what is the difference between critical and non-critical path. Now let's go about developing the schedule. When we do the schedule, there are 2 steps that we take. One is a forward pass and one is a backward pass. Now let's first take the step 1, start with the forward pass. The activity A starts on day 1. Let's say activity starts on day 1. In your case, probably actual project, there will be some specific date. But here we are saying it starts on day 1. So when it starts on day 1, and which really is early start for activity A is 1. We have a duration of 7. So using this particular formula, we'll calculate the early finish, and in which case the early finish is 7. So what really means is activity A starts on day 1 and finishes on day 7, because the duration is 7 days. Activity B will start after activity A, and same as activity C. So what is happening is, we are now calculating the early start for activity B and activity C. And the way we calculate is, it is the early finish for activity A plus 1. And then what we are going to do based on this early start for B and early start for A and the duration, the same way we would have calculated the early finish for B and C. Similarly, we go about calculating early start and early finish for D. So in other words, we have done the step 1, which is forward pass. Then we go into the backward pass. In backward pass, what we do is, we first start from the end. So now the last activity that we have, the early finish of D, the last activity, is the same as late finish for D. And because we have this duration of D as 12, we determine the late start for D, which is late finish minus duration plus 1. And so we get 23, day 23 is the late finish for D. When we have that, we can get the late finish for B and C, which is really 23 minus 1, because it has to be done one day before the D starts. And from there, we calculate similarly the late start for B and C, and late start for A, and early and late finish for A. So we do all this calculation as we are doing the backward pass. Now we go into something interesting. What we do is we calculate something called float. The way float is calculated is it can be late finish minus early finish, or it can be late start minus early start. So what you see here in D, it is 0, because 34 minus 34 is 0. Whereas in B, it is 7. This 22 minus 15 is 7, and all other ones, A and C, is 0. So what this really tells us, that if C is delayed, for example, C, the float is 0. If C is delayed even by 1 day, the project will shift by 1 day, end date. Similarly for A, similarly for D. But if the activity B gets delayed by 2 days, there will be no impact on the final date of the project. It will still be in 34 days. So what will happen? It starts on 8 days and it finishes on 15 days, day 10. Instead of finishing on day 15, sorry, it will finish on day 17. But anyway, activity D is not going to start before 23rd, so there is no impact. So if you get delayed in the activity B, let's say by 6 days, instead of finishing on 15, it finished on 20 is 1, still there is no issue. I mean, there's no problem. So essentially, till 7 days, so 7 days the float. There is a flexibility in activity B for 7 days. If it gets delayed up to 7 days, then there is no impact in the final date of the project. Having said that, if the delay is more than 7 days, then it will impact the final date of the project. And that is the float. That is the float, that is the flexibility that we talk about. So that was our backward pass. Now, when we do this, one thing, when we look at this, it might become a little bit scary, the schedule that we looked at, right? Because we were looking at just 4 activities. And we're looking at 4 activities, and it looked pretty complicated, right? If we have to do ourselves, it won't be trivial. It will take a lot of time. And in real projects, we don't have 4 activities. We have hundreds of activities. We have thousands of activities. How will we even do that, this kind of schedule? The consolation is, we don't have to do this manually. We need to understand how it is done, but we don't have to do it manually, because we will be using some software. We are talking about PMIS, Project Management Information System, some software where we'll put in all the data, and that particular software will do all this scheduling, will develop the schedule for us. Having said that, when it does, you will find, based on what input has gone in, based on what the sequence that you put in, there are things that you need to do because it might have broken some constraint. And this is where the resource optimization comes in. You might have to do 2 things. For example, when we talk about resource optimization, the first thing is resource leveling. Now let's look at what it is. Now, resource leveling is when you are breaking some, or you need to break, adhere to some kind of resource constraints. And when you have drawn the schedule, developed the schedule, you find there is some over allocation of resources. And when you do a resource leveling, we'll take an example. When you do a resource leveling, one of the things that needs to be remembered is, in resource leveling, we can adjust the start and finish dates. That's allowed. And we'll also try to use the available float when we are leveling the resource. And critical path may change here in resource leveling. So, in other words, just to give you an example, or what we really mean by resource leveling, see here, we are saying resource leveling. In other words, when we are drawing the schedule, we might find that one particular resource has been allocated because each of the resources will do different types of works. And we found, because of the sequence, because of the way we have structured it and so on, because of different constants, some of the resource might have been allocated 16 hours of work, or some might have been allocated 8 hours of work, but then this resource for that particular day is available only for 4 hours. So when that happens, you have to level it to meet the constraints. So this is what we talk about. We have to adhere to that resource constraint, and we have to see there is no over allocation. And when we are doing this adjustment, and we use the resource leveling technique in the resource optimization, we can change the critical path, we can change the dates, and of course we'll try to use the float by moving around the activities. So let's take an example here. Let's say this is what we have. What we have here is activity A, activity B, and activity C. In activity A, Tom and Sue are doing 8 hours of work. Activity B requires Sue to do 8 hours of work. From our sequencing, because activity A and B can start together, we have put them, let us come in day 1, we'll do activity A and B, and activity C will do in 2. So what we find here is we are finishing in 2 days. This particular sequence, we are finishing in 2 days. Having said that, we see that Sue is working for 16 hours in day 1. Now, that is something we need to level. We need to level because we cannot allocate more than 8 hours of work to Sue. So what we do? We shift activity B to the next day. And when we shift that activity B to next day, activity A will become on day 1, activity B will go to this day 2, and as a result, activity C also will move. So finally, what will happen is, what we see is, this is the kind of sequence you'll see after the resource leveling is done. What is happening? We are first doing activity A, and here you are finding that Tom and Sue are 8 hours. Activity B is being done in day 2 again, and the resource is now leveled. And as a result, activity C shifts to 3 days, and the whole project is being done in 3 days instead of 2 days. So this is an example of resource leveling. As opposed to resource leveling, you can do the optimization through resource smoothing. In resource smoothing, again, it is done because there is some kind of resource constraints, and you have to adhere to the limitations of the availability of resource. But the essential difference between resource smoothing and resource leveling is, In resource leveling, you can change the dates, final date, start date, and end date. That completion date in resource smoothing cannot change. The project cannot be delayed. So how will you do that? You will have to work with the float that you have. You have to work with the float and make the sequence and adjust your resources such a way that the float are getting consumed instead of the date getting shifted. As a result, the critical path will not change in resource smoothing. So this is essentially difference. Just make sure you don't get confused in PMP exam. Resource leveling and resource smoothing both are the resource optimization process, whereas resource leveling, you can change the dates, critical path may change, whereas in resource smoothing, you cannot change the dates, project cannot get delayed, and critical path will not change. Then there is, in doing a schedule, developing schedule, you will also do the scenario analysis. So what if scenario? What if scenario analysis, you will do different kind of scenarios. You think of different scenarios, you try to predict and evaluate what will happen if some kind of scenario takes place. What will be the impact to our schedule? So you will try to assess feasibility under different conditions, basically. You think of what, if this happens, what will happen, and you think of some unexpected condition. So some of the examples are like, if you are depending on an external company to deliver some components, what if they don't deliver in time? So that's a scenario you are trying to think, and then what will be the impact to your project, to your schedule? And or if a new regulation is you expect to come. So if a new regulation comes up, what will be the impact to our project? What will be the impact in terms of our schedule? So these are different scenarios, possible scenarios you think, and try to take some or think through how we'll act to those kind of scenario if that happens. Then there is this simulation. The simulation is really about trying to model the risk and uncertainty in the project. You remember there are many different work packages that are involved, and each will have its duration, and each will have its own certainty, uncertainty, and risk. And so what you do is you simulate that scenario, and come up with what is going to, what can happen. And so the way it is done is for you see what are the underlying factors behind each of these risks in each of these packages, take many different scenarios, and thousands and thousands scenarios, you try to draw a probability distribution. So, and from this particular probability distribution, you determine what are the probable outcome. One of them is, one technique is very well-known technique in simulation is Monte Carlo simulation. So when we do that, this is something what you see. For example, here if you look at it closely, and let me take this, okay. So what you see here is, we are saying that this particular project, there is a 10% probability it will get over on May 30th through this probability distribution. And we can say that there is a 90% probability, which is 80 plus 10, 90% probability it will get over in May 28th. So this is how you look at the simulation. This is how you explain through the probability distribution your finish date or schedule in your project. Then there is this concept of schedule compression. Schedule compression is about, let's say you are doing a project and you are going to finish in 3 months. You have made the plan, everything is fine, then your user comes and says, hey, there is something that has happened in the business. We cannot have it after 3 months. You need to compress the schedule. You have to deliver it in 2.5 months. So when you have to compress a schedule, there are two techniques that are used. You can use. One is called crashing. So crashing is basically you are shortening the duration by putting additional resources. But then this might mean that there will be more risk involved, there will be more cost when you're putting in additional resources. And for example, it will be like overtime. If you are paying overtime so that people can stay long hours and do your projects, and so that this project gets over, it will cost, and there might be risk because they are overworked, the quality might suffer, and so on. Or you can also add additional resources from outside to actually crash the project. So if you look at it, this is something that is going to happen. For example, analysis in your initial and plan, analysis was going to take 5 days, design 5 days, and implementation 5 days. So the project was going to start on day 1 and would finish in day 15. And we are using one person to do, just as for an example, analysis, one person to design, and one person to implementation. Now, when we crash it, what will happen probably, we'll put 2 person here in analysis, and it is finishing in 4 days. Then we start the design, we put 2 person, design when you put 2 person, it'll finish in 3 days. So design after 4 days, so immediately after analysis, design is started. And similarly, we finished implementation in 3 days, we put 2 person. So when we have put 2 person in crashing, we found that we have compressed the schedule from 15 days to 10 days. So this is the crashing technique on schedule compression. As opposed to crashing, there is something called first tracking. Now, first tracking, we compress, instead of putting additional resources, we compress by performing work in parallel. Now, when we work in parallel, again, it might result in some rework, it might result in some quality, and so on. And it might also require increased coordination effort because you are doing multiple things in parallel. So let's take an example for first tracking. Let's say, again, this particular project, like before, was finishing in 15 days, 5-day analysis, 5-day design, 5-day implementation with 1 person working. Now we need to compress it. We don't take additional resource like crashing. We keep the same number of resource. So what we do is, we do the analysis, we have 1 person, but design, instead of starting in day 6, we say we'll do, even before analysis finished, on day 5, we'll start the design. So, so because we are doing 1 person, it's still taking 5 days, but because we've started early, it is finishing in day 9. Similarly, implementation. We said even before design is complete, in day 8, we'll start the implementation. And so what we see, even with 1 person, because we are running some work in parallel, we are finishing in 12 days instead of 15 days. We have compressed the schedule from 15 days to 12 days. Now, because we are doing something in parallel, for example, we have started the design on day 8. What happens when the design is done after day 9, and then Yeah, what has happened is, there is some review, it went through some review and some changes has to be made. It will have an impact on the work that we have already done in implementation. We have to do some rework. So there is this downside of for first tracking. And then we have the agile release planning. Let's talk about agile, how we'll handle it in agile. In agile, we have a product vision that gives us the product roadmap, and that provides us the release plan. Because you remember in agile, we said we are not taking everything together, we take through iteration, we have multiple releases. So we go through different levels of release. So what happens is, because of the vision, the roadmap, we create a release plan. In other words, we say, based on the vision, based on the roadmap, based on what the business wants to do, we'll have 3 releases. Release 1, release 2, release 3. Now, each of this release, we will determine what are the iterations. So we say, for this release 1, we'll have multiple iterations. Iteration 0 to n, let's say 10 iteration, or 5 iterations. So this is what we determine. And then for each of these iteration, we talk about the story, features. In each of the iteration, what are the different features we want to have? So there might be feature A, feature B, feature C, feature D. And for each feature will have different detail level story points, which will tell us what are the tasks that needs to be done. So for example, in feature A, the story 1 might have task A as 6 hours, task B as 4 hours, task C 3 hours, task D 9 hours. So this is how we have planned for feature A, this user story 1. Similarly, we go to feature B, feature C, feature D, and then this will give us iteration 0, then again iteration 1, iteration 2. So this is how we plan release in Agile. This is the Agile release. The output for developed schedule, we have the schedule baseline, which is the approved schedule model that we have developed, and the project schedule. Project schedule might also have bar charts, something like that we might be familiar with. And then there might be milestone charts, which tells us what are the different milestones at what point and which period and so on. We talked about milestones are activity with 0 duration. So this is when we'll come across each of the milestones. And then, of course, there might be some schedule network diagram as well. Along with that, there might be scheduled data. There will be scheduled data as the output for the developed schedule, which is resource requirements by time period, so that we can look at what are the resources we need, alternative schedules, or some applied schedule reserves. What are the reserve, when you did the reserve analysis, what are the reserves that we talked about? It's also important to consider the project calendar. Project calendar is about what are the working days and shifts, because we don't want to plan for holidays, and then when there is a holiday, we suddenly find that our whole plan has gone off because we forgot to take into consideration the holidays that exist in this particular office, in this particular country. Now with this, we finish the develop schedule. I know we are a little bit over time, but there's only one more process, and let us just finish this process so that next day we can work on our next knowledge area. The control schedule is the next process. The next process we'll talk about is a control schedule. In its control schedule, the inputs that will have a project management plan, project documents, and work performance data. The tools that we'll use again some of these tools that we talked about, because control schedule is really about ensuring that we are on track. And outputs will have work performance information. There will be some focus, change requests, like other control processes. So what we do in control schedule, we determine current project status, because as we are executing, we will have to track, keep a track on where we are at this point of time in terms of our schedule. We'll also keep thinking of what are the different factors that are influencing schedule changes. If, let's say, it has got delayed, what it is that made the project delay? How can I get it in, correct the situation? And if something unexpected has happened, for which, of course, we have kept some reserves. Remember, we talked about contingency reserves for known unknowns, and if some risk surfaces, risk get triggered, we need to apply those reserves in the schedule. And if there are changes, we have to manage those changes. For example, if there are scope changes because of which it impacts the schedule, we need to change the schedule. We need to take an approval on the change, and we need to have a new baseline for this schedule. Now, in the agile approach, there are some things that we'll talk about, which is really we determine current status of elapsed time cycle. We talk about time cycle because we are talking about different iterations. And when we are going through the process, we will do retrospectives. If you remember, when we talked about agile, retrospectives is where the team come together and will reflect on what has happened well, where we can improve, and so on and so forth. In other words, if you really remember that agile team is really a self-managed team. And typically they will find out among themselves what is it that needs to be done. And then there will be constant reprioritizing of work plan in the agile approach. And we, as a project manager or someone who is the facilitator in the agile approach, we will be keeping an eye on the delivery rate or the velocity per iteration. How, what is our speed in providing the output? And again, we'll have to keep on determining and managing changes, because though we encourage change in agile approach, we'll have to manage those changes. We'll have to make sure that it goes through the proper process, and so on and so on. In terms of data analysis, there are several things that we'll do. One is we'll do earned value analysis, and we'll talk about earned value analysis in our next knowledge area. And we'll determine the schedule variance, we'll determine the schedule performance index that will tell us, are we on time? If you're not on time, how delayed we are, and so on and so forth. Then for agile, we will probably use iteration burn down chart, which really tracks the remaining work in iteration backlog. So this is how it looks like in iteration burn down chart. So let me take a highlighter and show you. So what you see here, this particular line, straight line that is going down, this is the ideal remaining work. So basically this is what we have planned for. And on this particular day, we have so much of work left. And as we move through, we are saying that we will be finishing all this work on in the chart, and on day 10 we should be finished. But then when we're keeping track, we find instead of going through the straight line, it is moving in this fashion, And so based on this line, we might actually do a focus and say that, hey, though we said it will take 10 days, it seems it will take 12 days. And if required, we might want to do some investigation on that. Then the third one is the performance reviews, which will measure, compare, analyze schedule performance against baseline. So we will continually, as we move through, we'll be comparing our performance against the schedule baseline that we have. We'll also do trend analysis. We talked about trend analysis because when we look at our performance over time, we will be able to find out what is the trend. Are things deteriorating? Are things getting better? And if it is deteriorating, what is it that we need to do to get it back on track? Or variances analysis is really about looking at the plan versus actual as of today. We also talked about what if scenario analysis. We'll continuously look at different scenarios. As we are doing this control schedule, what happens? What will be the impact on the schedule if such thing happens, and so on. So with this, we have finished this particular module, which is the project schedule management, and we'll step into project cost management as our next module tomorrow. Thank you for being with me today, and I'll see you tomorrow again.